Good evening. I'm going to tell you really briefly about the three last upcoming events, or the three upcoming last events of the fall semester of the Holloway series and its progeny, or whatever you call it. It spawned a lot of extra activities this semester. The first of those is on Friday, November 19, which is a celebration of the publication of the incredible 4-volume complete poems of Larry Eigner. And there will be various speakers here to celebrate that event and a reception afterward. The speakers include the two editors of the complete Larry Eigner volumes, who are Robert Grenier and Curtis Faville. Larry's brother, Richard Eigner, will be here to speak a little bit about Larry's background and sort of early years as a poet. And then various scholars, poets, speaking and or reading from Eigner's work, including Rebecca Gatos, who's a graduate student here, Kit Robinson, who's a Bay Area poet, Hilary Gravendike, who did her PhD dissertation here, wrote a chapter on Eigner and now teaches at Pomona College, Norma Cole, who's a Bay Area poet from San Francisco, and Robert Hass, who I'm sure many of you know because of his being part of the English department here. On November 30th will be another publication party, so to speak, in celebration and acknowledgement of the publication of an anthology called Indivisible, a contemporary anthology of South Asian American poetry, focusing on work by American poets whose ethnic and or to some degree cultural roots are in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. There are 3 editors of that volume, and one of them, Sumi Kaipa, did her undergraduate degree here in English. She and the 2 other editors, and also Swati Rana, who's a current grad student who's just about to file her dissertation here at Berkeley, they will be presenting work from that anthology. And then the last event of this fall semester will be a memorial reading celebration of the life and work of the late poet Leslie Scalapino. And that will feature a number of writers who have been influenced by and engaged with Leslie Scalapino's work, as well as film screening of short bits from film works by the Bay Area cinematographer Conrad Steiner, who did several works based on Scalapino's writings. Tonight's event features 2 poets, one of whom used to live here and one of whom still does. The one who still does will begin the evening, and that's Charlie Legere, whom I think many of you will know. He's going to be introduced by Daniel Thomas Glass. Dan Glass is the editor of With Plus Stand, copies of which are here on the table. He's a poet and currently a grad student about to file his dissertation at UC Davis in their English department. And then I will introduce Kenneth Irby, who's our esteemed visiting guest after Charlie Legere's reading, and I will come back and say more about Ken Irby at that point. All right, please, Dan Glass.
Hi. So Charles Legere is sometimes known as Chuck and sometimes known as Charlie. In pictures, he is holding his son Leon or his wife Louisa, holding pictures of himself or a bottle of water, a bottle of wine, or someone's hair. In videos, he watches plays called Charquette that depict the birth of his son as a daughter. In status updates, he promises to have Hall & Oates dance marathons and applies for jobs. He is in the part of finishing his dissertation that involves applying for jobs and not finishing his dissertation, which is about teaching contemporary poetry. In poems, he thinks about some poets he knows in 2010, An Extraordinary Rendition, and Oakland. I want to talk about Charles or Chuck or Charlie's thinking about Oakland, but before I do, I would like to say that he is a really funny and thoughtful person. We occasionally meet with our families and friends at Picante on 6th Street because it welcomes people like us who have young children, and I enjoy these meetings a great deal. Full disclosure, I published Charles or Chuck or Charlie's work in Withstand number 4, which you can pick up for free over there. There are a few more copies. And Leon rides around in an infant car seat formerly occupied by my daughter, Sonia. Okay, so let me put forward a thesis about poetry as supplied by Dylan Westbrook. The problem is perspective, the problem is perspective and the limits thereof. The problem is representation and of and by whom. The problem is an object which moves faster than its signifiers. The problem is limitlessness against finite experience. The problem is race and class and a text with and without both. The problem is irreducible, unsolvable. The solution is a poem, end quote. Dylan wrote that in an introduction to Charles or Chuck or Charlie's My Oakland project, which is part of the excellent Deep Oakland archive. In that project, Charles or Chuck or Charlie wrote a bunch of lyric poems and called them each and collectively My Oakland. I don't know if it's fair to call the poems solutions, really. Maybe they are broken surfaces in which the problems Dylan suggests get refracted and returned to us in new and unfamiliar shapes. In My Oakland, I see representation washing against the self like Lake Merritt birdshit water against Lake Merritt birdshit shore, quote, a plaster statue of myself, end quote. It dives into personal and shared histories of place, imagining A's games in Vietnam as a, quote, reconstructed body, gradations of represent and Oscar Grant marches, the pre-trial versions. I see the poem building itself of place, of people, of numbers within numbers, of language within noise, of the graffiti of the Bart's whoosh punctuating the day. I see the poem building out from this metal and bodied music, from this painted surfacing, to a Frankenstein's demography of shipping routes, sound traces, racial profiles, freeway exits, catwalks, and Black Panthers. It tries to make its body, the speaking body, the poem's body, encompass all of that, which is an impossible and a necessary task. That is why I appreciate Charles or Chuck or Charlie so much, for the courage it takes to write impossible poetry. We are lucky to live in a moment when people are still making that attempt. It is a true pleasure to introduce him tonight. Please help me welcome Charles or Chuck or Charlie Leger.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Lynn and Rosa, for hosting the series and for all your hard work doing it. If we could take a second to give a hand for the two of them for all the work they do, for all the things. And Kenneth Irby, it's an honor to read with you. Thank you for coming. Some of the poets I know in 2010 are waiting to write until they have something important enough to write, and therefore never write. Some of the poets I know in 2010 have to get in a trance-like state to write. Some of the poets I know in 2010 talk less about poetry than their poetry ambitions. Some of the poets I know in 2010 don't have to work for money, which makes them constantly doubt whether they should be really doing whatever it is they're doing. Some of the poets I know in 2010 write poems with unique words and sounds and word combinations that don't say anything. Some of the poets I know in 2010 go to more protests and marches than anybody else I know. Some of the poets I know in 2010 are way behind on email. Some of the poets I know in 2010, once they've figured out who their readers are, will begin to antagonize them. Some of the poets I know in 2010 have been trying to get their poems published and can't, and complain about that. Some of the poets I know in 2010 are alcoholics and get drunk to write, though I think they'd write better sober. Some of the poets I know in 2010 don't go to other poets' readings. Some of the poets I know in 2010 seem open-minded but have convictions about poetry that make them gruff and red in the face if you say something different. Some of the poets I know in 2010 are writing poems about John Rambo. Some of the poets I know in 2010 have had to stop dating each other. Some of the poets I know in 2010 will only talk to me if they think I might help them meet someone who will get them published or get them a job. Some of the poets I know in 2010 say you have to find your voice. Some of the poets I know in 2010 say imagination is a bugaboo. Some of the poets I know in 2010 did, are doing, or want to do MFAs or PhDs. Some of the poets I know in 2010 first got into poetry by reading a poet they now found silly. Some of the poets I know in 2010 do all their writing in workshops. Some of the poets I know in 2010 like to ask the first question in the Q&A, and it'll be a long one. Some of the poets I know in 2010 once idealized a poet who they're now disappointed in. Some of the poets I know in 2010 you wouldn't know they were a poet. Some of the poets I know in 2010 are embarrassed to admit that they haven't read certain books yet. Some of the poets I know in 2010 wish a poet could still fill a stadium with a reading. Some of the poets I know in 2010 become suspicious of any poet who wins prizes or sells a lot of books. Some of the poets I know in 2010, if you ask them to read for 20 minutes, will read for 5. Some, if you ask them to read for 20 minutes, will read for 40. Some of the poets I know in 2010 don't read certain kinds of poetry. Some of the poets I know in 2010 try to write in such a way as to make it clear they're dissatisfied with the English language because it's a language of empire. Some of the poets I know in 2010 want a poem to move them. Some of the poets I know in 2010 have decided to stop writing. Some of the poets I know in 2010 can't stand Anglo-American modernism, and some think it's the wellspring. Some of the poets I know in 2010 write from personal experience. Some of the poets I know in 2010 revise. Some of the poets I know in 2010 would like me to read their poems and comment. Some of the poets I know in 2010 are writing about aesthetic and social forms, like Lisa Robertson. Some of the poets I know in 2010. Oh, thanks. Here's another poem about poetry. It's called Braising. It sort of has an epigraph. It doesn't really have an epigraph, but I think the epigraph kind of situates it, so I added one. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow and affect another nature. And that's Sydney. I began to say clean, stuck in the mud, spoke out of line, knew that that worked. Go into a program, talk later. Meant what I said, the key to forget. Or did you say petals? All talk of lies. Open into a wood. Or was it thrushes? Clearer after the storm. I didn't say that. Open into a brazen. One mode for this. Check up on it. Over for now. Wasn't for real. Blade. Out of my mind I seized my arms. Don't say. Spell golden. I began to say in Iraq. Range. Stick to inventing. So do you say petals? It used to work like this. Thrashes. Up from a page. Kitchenalia. Got 6 here. Doesn't lie. Should it be so? Lit off, up from clouds into clouds. Cut, spreading open, long gash in a horse's gut. To say nothing. Knew that. And another poem about poetry. Maybe I'll just say now, they're probably all about it. Silk flowers. The car radio, a far-off chord, repeating, feeling all right, like into a paper cup, into rising sea sounds under an overpass, and silk flowers, swags, sprays, bunches of hydrangeas, of orchids, lavender, wisteria, tulip, fuse runs down, and the crackle barrage, an aerial repeater, white and blue pearls of brilliant chrysanthemums, wolf packs of rainbow bangers, black smoke snake pythons, glowworm boas go off to a blue center finale, an enormous payoff, in overheard utterance, in static, in waves, into misconstrual. This is called 256 Platinums, and it's about pop music. Now here I go again. I begin dreaming that I will always love you and say, yes it is. Boy, when were you man? What are you doing till I see my Marianne needed more to hold, to come to your senses, or to light up his smoke than just a telephone? I close my eyes as the one that I belonged to made a meal out of me, and leave those kids alone, because you know sometimes words come back for more dark sarcasm, and she slipped away. There's a feeling I get when about to strike the queen of diamonds, like a heartbeat, drives you mad in my arms. To the west for your life, on the trigger beat you if she's able. Girl, jumped the gun, drove a truck, a thriller, killer, laid upon your head as your table. I will always, hey, why don't you come too? Okay, so the next 2 poems are like more explicitly about the Iraq War. Actually, they're about our current state of war, which is in many different parts of the world. The first one's called Silver Bullet. On this issue, there is no silver bullet. Again, it isn't a win-or-lose thing, and it's not that I allege that the move was timed to divert attention from proprietary rights over the disruptive patternings, which, at the micro and macro levels, disperse a surveillance attention to either staged, strategic, gradual withdrawal, or a surge, brief and temporary, in advance of handing over a photorealistic, that is, depictatory pattern, such as leaves and branches, which does work, but only in a local context, out of which cutting and running is not on the table. Again, there is no silver bullet. Movement can give the target away, as can shadow. In natural settings, night is a camouflage, as is shadow. And this one's called Buffed. My friend Rob joined the Marines in 1997 and got out in 2004. I can't remember where they sent him first, but I know that after 9/11 he went to Afghanistan, then Guantanamo. I talked to him on his cell phone while he was there once. Guantanamo was extremely boring, and Rob said he hated it and the Marines. He had made sergeant, so he was in charge of a squad, about a dozen men. But the soldiers had started going off and fighting each other. 2 guys in Rob's squad had killed themselves by hanging and shooting. Rob had to write letters to their families. The soldiers in his squad started coming to him one by one, saying they were depressed, angry, hearing voices, and thinking about suicide. Rob had sent them to the psychiatrist, who said they needed more exercise. The men in Rob's squad spent all day together in the gym, lifting weights frantically. By the time Rob got out, they were huge. Okay, and then I'm going to read a few poems from that My Oakland poem that Dan mentioned, which is actually, if you want to check it out, it's free. It's online. Probably just Google it or something of that sort. And I wrote one new one, which I'll end with. Maybe I'll flag it before I get there. So, My Oakland. We call it Handles. My rise of Oakland smoking. What stars? Blurry on tinted windows, and black clouds spreads over, call it Evergreen, Maersk, Sealand, Africa, and Wake Aves. Dipping hard, pulling against the wheel, call it Oakland smoke, whipping swirls and loops. My Oakland 2000 is 399,484, is 35.7% black, 31.3% white, are 15.2% Asian American, 0.7% Native American, is 19.4% below poverty line, 77,500 people, mostly children, are 0.5% Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. My median per capita income, $21,936 to $21,587, the national per capita, to ride past my no place. Am 11.7% other, 5.0% 2 or more. Am 21.9% Hispanic Latino of all races. Am median age 33, maybe here, 31.3%, 0.7%, 21.9%, 19.4%, 35.7%, 0.5%, 5.0%, 11.7%. My Oakland, my Vietnam, that reconstructed body, mine. Dreams and the sparrows in my body, blooming in a coffin in my heart. Vines, una lengua, rotting like a bottle brush from the inside. The ones I love are they. My Oakland, that my shadow in a heat shear, a line creeping and obliterated, cracks in concrete, shelves of mine rending, shore, blue schist, brick, as he says it, a flame, that's my Kaiser, see my turn, wheeling, screeching down at the platform, mine as it whistles, ping, cool air and ride past no place, my footfall, soundless, diving for small fish. This is Dan's favorite, My Oakland. My Oakland, Huey P. Newton says in 1963 he taught himself to read by self-determination and wrote number 7, we want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people at 55th and Grove, aka MLK, in 1964. In 1967 at West and 27th, the BPP started their free breakfast, and October 28, 1967, Officer John Frey is killed. Huey P. Newton is charged in his bed in Kaiser Hospital. April 6, 1968, my On August 22nd, 1989, he was killed in a drug deal by a man who admits as a child he'd eaten the free breakfast. Barbecuing with Bobby Seale, hickory smoked ribs, pit smoked barbecue turkey. Even revolutionaries have to eat. Okay, and this is the last one I'll read. And I forgot to mention when I started reading the My Oakland things that actually there are some other interesting poems up on that website. And one of them is by Dan. It's really cool. It's got like photographs with it. You should check it out. And then another one is by Javier Huerta, who's in this department, and his is also really great. My Oakland. A stack of black plastic-wrapped trash cans stacked up saying Coca-Cola all over. And they say Oakland Pride. The voters say none of the above, and they say all reification is a forgetting. From proper to pronoun, abstract and back down, Cali is where they put they mac down. Gimme love. Thank you.
Charlie's gesture of thanking me and Rosa is so typically Charlie. He was the co-curator of this reading series for 2 years, last year and the year before. It's thanks to him that we have flowers here on the table. So I'd like to say thank you to Charlie. Perhaps more important on this occasion, thank you for a really great reading. It's hard for me to introduce Kenneth Irby, Ken Irby, without in some way being autobiographical. I've known Ken for 50 years. I was an undergraduate, an alienated undergraduate at then Radcliffe College in Cambridge, and Ken was the first real poet that I ever met. I was reading real poetry, but maybe not as real as I was about to read, thanks to Ken. He came to my parents' house for my 21st birthday and gave me a copy of Robert Creeley's For Love. And he invited me to come to Gloucester to meet Charles Olson. I was too shy to go to Gloucester to meet Charles Olson. We were just talking about that. Ken said he would have been sweet. I still doubt that, but Ken would have been sweet. But I don't think Olson would have been. In any case, it was like through Ken Irby that I began to inhabit what has been my lifetime habitat, which is a world of camaraderie with other poets and people who care about poetry. So I'm just going to read a few things that I wrote on this occasion because I don't want to make this autobiographical, at least not too much. Ken Irby's poems speak of landscapes, places, not sites but contexts, of grandeur and of details. At the same time, Ken Irby's poems speak of the social. These, landscape and the social, places and people, are intertwined. Irby's landscapes are places people have been. They are identifiable by virtue of being identified with others, historical personages, or more often friends. Irby might, in Karl Marx's words, aptly say, activity in direct association with others has become an organ for expressing my own life. Ken is a poet with a powerful sense of occasion, a deep understanding of precisely what the occasionality of lived life means, the camaraderie even in solitudes. Ken's work is suffused with a peculiar form of solicitude, a form of attentiveness and concern that expands into given moments, informs their character, and provides them with commonality, with something humanly real by virtue of having been shared. What you might listen for tonight are the unfoldings of time as what history leaves behind, and the structures, the poesis even, of value. The poems are structured by a layering of value. The valued is what holds. It is the real time of lived experience, and its sum, the full value, is coextensive with the real living of life. And then I'll just read my blurb for this incredibly beautiful, beautifully produced, beautifully conceived, and beautifully realized volume of his collected poems, The Intent On. With the publication of Kenneth Irby's The Intent On collected poems, 1962 to 2006, North Atlantic Books, which, by the way, is based here in Berkeley, makes available what is unquestionably a monumental work. In its scope, its gravitas, its emotional nobility, and in the poet's fidelity to the affective affinities that have made his felt a real life, this collection achieves something immutable, enduring. It is not the fleetingness of life, but the longevity of life's effects that Irby's poems make note of. The works unfold through the continuous remembering of person and places loved and known as loved. Love's reality is to love, Irby has written. This is the reality that his poetry, a poetry of expansively and lastingly experienced particulars, has achieved magnificently. Please welcome Kenneth Irby.
Thanks very much, Lynn and Charlie, for say more about writing more about Oakland, about any place. I just want to get out some other stuff here that isn't in the book. There. Well, thank you, Lynn and Rosa, for your setting this up, for the contact in all the arrangements for getting it together. And to be here in Berkeley, I did go here. I got a degree from Berkeley, a library degree in the days when that would have been something to do. No, it was... and I don't regret that at all, because I met some extraordinary people that way. But it seemed like a way to make a living, and it might have been, except that I didn't do anything with it. I went ahead and did other things. But living here is as important to me, has been as important to me as any other place I've ever been. And much as things have changed here and in San Francisco, it remains with resonances that are not forgotten. As Cambridge, still, for all of its changes, has its parts in me. And of course, where I grew up, I was born in Texas, and I grew up in a small town in Texas, and I grew up in a small town in Kansas, and then moved around. As one might. That maybe the sense of moving underscored the feeling of, well, where am I? You know, and that any of us carry with us in our various ways of accommodating to it. Coming to Berkeley was to another part of the world. I mean, I had actually been out in California to fly to Hawaii and then to Central Pacific when I was in the Army. But that wasn't like being here and finding the whole different world, a whole different landscape, a whole different sense of relation with plants and the microclimates and everything, the vegetation especially, which still resonates with me. Part of that, I want to, in thanking those who made it possible for this reading to take place, and for those who are here, and all of us together, also dedicate it to someone I got to know and lived with here in Berkeley back in those old days. I got here in 1964. The free speech movement had already started. This dear friend, more than friend, Lowell Levant, was part of that. He got arrested over here, sitting in Sproul, sent off to the prison, the county prison farm. And, a student of Gary Snyder's, and well, somebody with a great deal of wonderful person and presence. I met him, I was thinking, he died on the 10th of October, and I want to dedicate this reading to him. I'd hope to see him again, of course. Went to a reading, group of people reading down here on Telegraph one evening, I guess the beginning of 1967 maybe, something like that. And Robert Duncan had come over to have dinner. And I told him, well, there's this reading, it sounds interesting. And he said, let's go. And so we did, and there was this person who turned out to be Lowell reading a poem about Enkidu in Gilgamesh. And I thought, well, that's something. It is. It was. I mean, it's very curious. I haven't encountered anybody writing about that, writing a poem about it since. And we got to know each other and shared a house for a time. And he was a CO in the Vietnam War, and thus had to go do other things like the first was a space food experiment over here in what I don't know what the building is called or what it is used for now, but in those days it was the old home economics building, when they had departments like that, both in high schools and in colleges. And these guys were all sequestered on the top floor. They couldn't see anybody, and they were fed experimental foods for astronauts. And then all of their excrement, solid and liquid, was collected and tested, you know. And on Sunday afternoons for a short period, you could have visitors. And there were places up on the roofs where other fluids were exchanged, I assure you, but they were not being tested, you know. And then he went off and worked in a hospital in the Imperial Valley in a period of time. He was a very dear man. I can't think of a dearer, kindler, more gentle human being who grew up in L.A. and was, though not born in California, at heart profoundly so, and who told me early on, he said, my conviction is to work for the working class, and that's what he did. He was a truck driver for all going to UCLA and going to school here and whatnot. His allegiances lay still there. So I want to start with a poem in which he is at center. It's about, if you allow me to kind of flip around here, it takes a bit. This is a large volume. We didn't really start out to think that it was going to be, as I keep calling it, a doorstopper, but it is. And I want to thank, in that process, before I get into the poems, Richard Grossinger for calling me up one day about 3 years ago and saying that is to say, North Atlantic Books wanted to turn to publishing poems and things like that, which he had done much earlier in his career, and inviting me to do that. And then, so the book wouldn't have happened otherwise, and then the two former students, actually Cyrus is finishing up his doctoral dissertation, he's defending it like a month from now, who worked with me since they were undergraduates, Kyle Waugh and Cyrus Console, and Cyrus read here just last year, wasn't it? 2009, I think, in this same series, for the immense amount of work that they did in getting the texts, going through them, editing them, scanning them, you know, formatting them, dealing with the publisher in every regard. Without that, the book couldn't have happened. So if anybody's to be applauded this evening, along with those who rightfully have been, may we give a small hand to these people, because I couldn't have done it. And they had their own lives and work to deal with the whole time, too. But back in those days, when I first got to know Lowell, he had a, you know, like one of these things that one doesn't, if you haven't grown up around here or been familiar with Northern California or on up into the Northwest, where this is common, I hadn't encountered places where there would be these nice old houses, and in the back of them, cottages, or a cottage. He had not exactly a cottage, he had a cabin, I would say. It was about big enough, you know, it might have included the end of this platform, I guess. And the bathroom was in the house. And I was in a similar kind of place, maybe a little bit bigger, and we both needed to move. And Ruth, who's here, told us that another friend, Sam Thomas, we may get further with Sam, by the events of the time, that the place that he and his wife and daughter were in was available. So we moved in there. And one of the things we did a lot of was to explore the area. He knew the hills better than I did, and then we went up into Reyes and all around. This is simply about hiking up in Strawberry Canyon, starting up the end of Lynn Street, Russell Street, and going up into what was then the School for the Blind, or a dirt road around it, and it brought you up into it still does, I would assume, into the fire trails along the top, you know, that would lead you to Tilden eventually. But Lowell knew this particular point, which you had to know because it was not obvious, where you cut off, take that little path, and it would bring you down Strawberry Canyon, past the Botanical Garden and all the rest, back in the football stadium and all that, back into the campus. So this is for that, and much else. It's simply called Strawberry Canyon Poem. We followed the fire road up into the hills for nighttime's sake, for smells of jasmine and of amaryllis, the faintest light register on the side bush growth. Ceanothus, I said to Lowell, would cover most of any guesses, what, not for the unaccounted registers of recollection, not of tabulation whose, Lowell for the distance from those lights of the Rad Lab and Chicken Farm still lit our way. And I was off for any stripping off my shirt till the mosquitoes, sensuality of unintended impingements, trying incorrectly, as we argued and I lost, to place this pace along this fire road with all the other times. I hear that is the mappists fixed by what should be the necessary lineaments of growing things that nonetheless follow no and will not be described by a sheer memory, the greatest adjunct only if more important attentions are incessantly work. The path back by the quickest weight of the rut in the dark, only the feet to the contour worn by the same suspended searching, blind and certain as the vine. But its clear hour, too, for Lowell went first down the path, the last stretch. Way is Polysemous, remembered, and at the fingers and the words, re-nerved. Well, he was a dear man, and I'm happy to go back to that because it's not a time, and Ruth kindly read it at the memorial service for Lowell here in the Alumni Center a week ago. Will be Saturday. And this one, when Bob Grenier and I connected at the DeYoung this afternoon with friends of his who kindly made it possible for me to go to this Gauguin and Van Gogh and Cézanne and other people show at the DeYoung, which is extraordinary for the other people especially, but for everybody in it. It was quite wonderful. One of these events that you can't take in. You know, it absorbs you and wears you out. And yet, man, wow. There was this little famous talisman painting on a cigar box lid by Paul Seroussier called The Talisman, just painted with straight colors, no mixing and any of that, in almost abstract landscape terms that I had last seen. The only other time I'd ever seen was when the art museum at Berkeley was a little, I don't know what that building was, a little powerhouse over here before they built the art museum. In any case, there that painting was, and there it was again from the d'Orsay in Paris, like, well, there I felt, the link again, and then Golden Gate Park and all that. And then when we came over, Bob said, well, I need something to keep me going. So we stopped in the Mediterranean, and he had a coffee. So may I offer this, 3 August 1971. For Lowell and Lowell, another friend of that time. And it's prose. It's straight, trying to keep a track of what had happened that day. Not that it be lost. Cyrus asked me, when he looked at my notebooks, do you feel it necessary to keep a record of what you've done? And I said, well, I can't remember otherwise very well, I'm afraid. It's also a way of, long ago I realized if I had to wait for inspiration, then things were not likely to happen too often. So I started just writing a journal or whatever, that out of which maybe with what I was writing there, things would begin to pick up. And I'll read a couple items before we conclude this evening of recent quick little registrations like that. But here, the Mediterranean, not that much different, if any, than what it was in those days. 1971, well, to Sonoma County yesterday, visiting Mike and Pam Ross to pick up Lowell's records. Homebrew and notebooks under the apricot trees. Pigs and sheep, chickens, dogs, big garden on one side and the layers of distance set by the eucalyptus on the hills, showing depths through as if cliff precipice sided, continually ticked with the wind-shifted leaf shimmer. The great meat sole bird with teeth. Foxy, poisonous women invoked. What do you remember of what you've written and how long afterwards? News of Chico and of carpenter's work, Mike, an apprentice. I want some kind of headwork I can fall back on if I get hurt, if my hands get hurt. A carpenter depends on his hands. I can plan, like when I got that splinter in my thumb, but I need something I can fall back on and make money at if I can't work like I am now. Brommage's analytical mind. Red printers, binders, cloth-bound, dummy, blank page, notebook now filled. I finished my first book and started on another one. Scepter, 4-foot, onion stalk, bulb to crown of florets, shaft swelling like an eriogonum inflatum deflatum. Pam and I eat about 2 cloves of garlic apiece every day. Did you walk out back to the frontier? Yeah, you mean up that hill? Get a good view of the freeway. With of smog, yeah. Laughter beyond humor. Belly relaxer. Comings and goings of dogs. Rosebud, Rosie, Rose, Bean, Tulpa, Lowell, Rodeo, Mike. There's a lot in your notebook about sheep slaughtering. You done your own? I hit the sheep over the head with a hammer and then cut their throats. I slaughtered 6 sheep for this guy and he gave me 1. What are you going to do with the pigs? Well, Portia's a brood sow, not for meat. I'll probably keep one of the little ones when they're big enough. Shoats. What are their names? Their names? One of them's called, and the other one's called, and the other's names are pork and bacon. I like to work about 6 hours and then quit around 1 or 2, rest, sleep a few hours, talk or read, have a little dinner, and then go back to work. I've been working 12 hours a day that way. All jobs in America ought to be like that. Knock off in the middle of the day like a siesta. And in the field below, the other house. A swayback bony horse and a sad, quiet burro. Mike at work with his friend on that other house, ripping up boards, putting in a new kitchen. We left by 4:30, back down the dead-end road, Penn Grove to Katati, to find and say goodbye to another friend, and she not at home. Bean played Joy Spring on the piano, and Couperin's Les Barricades Mystérieuses. Lowell left a note for Joanna and talked with her tall, blonde roommate who came in and wondered who we were. And then back to Berkeley, stopping in Vallejo at Tony's Bar and Packaged Goods across the alley from the Greyhound bus depot for dime beers and cheese twists, eyeing the array of cheap liquor and sandwich signs, and old gentlemen, black and white and Filipino, having old granddad at 35 cents a shot with dime beer chasers. Are you going back to the Philippines this year? White Panama'd, white-haired, white gentleman to white Panama'd Filipino gentleman. No, I went back last year to see your children. Back into the cool of Berkeley and the bay after the Coast Range inner heat. The slope of time, a day at a time. August fall slant across the apricot-shaded grass stubble. The clarity of our days slipping with us, filling the great inner lake of accumulation. I certainly can remember sitting there. It's where I first met Ron Silliman, who was in high school, I think, coming in and, writing in the Mediterranean, which, and the other one that I spent a lot of time in, doesn't exist anymore, was over here on the north side. Hearst and Euclid are just slightly down toward the bay from that, which we all called ENSO. So you could sit there like these places for a whole day with a cup of coffee and write, and nobody bothered you. And you never knew who you might see in that regard. And so before I conclude this evening, I'm going to read one other short couple of pieces for Lowell out of that time. But this goes back, the earliest poem in it was written that year when Lynn and I met, and when Bob Grenier and I met quite individually, separately, I mean, from one another. They didn't get to know one another until later. And I don't think Lynn and I have yet figured out who it was that introduced us. Maybe David Hoare, yeah. Is this poem from the fall I got out of and went back to Cambridge, was there to study Far Eastern things. And it's called The Grasslands of North America, and it's dedicated to Bob Grenier, so definitely to read it this evening for him. It starts with a line which is a quote from one of the early explorers. Only a succession of far-reaching green prairies. The grass that is in my backyard. As we move down the hill in the grass, looking past the highway toward Hammond, our pants and legs caught thick in it, the same winds blowing. Where Pike entered Kansas, and after drunk in high school, we ended the piss in the clover, the smell of clover, so strong for miles, we stopped the car and got out, drunk in the roadway. That same country has entered, the first time it was ever seen, is entered again and again. Each time I come to it, as I came here at 3 out of Texas, was the new world. There must be in the juice and flesh a same plain as these, the same moving wave as this grass. the body comes back to, only having heard as they only heard by hearsay and believed it. Well, there are definitely later matters here that I want to give some attention to as well. Which is, they're not all about a place, but that's central to them. But you know, question of what place is, and in hearing Charlie's quite wonderful ongoing, I trust, I hope, sequence about Oakland, which has not been graced with poetic attention in the way that some other places have, and should be. I wasn't quite into Oakland, but I was very close to it on Russell Street, but a different part of it from where Lynn lives. And just a bit, you know, from Ashby. And I've been teaching Patterson the last couple of weeks of William Carlos Williams, which is a exasperating and complicated and still wonderful poem about, as Robert Duncan used to say, it was another presence of this place, since he was a student here after World War II for a while, and wrote about it memorably. He said, well, you have to have heard Robert in his voice, and I'm not exaggerating. You know. Well, and back in those days, you know, he really did talk like this. It was quite wonderful, but we didn't feel any need to publish because we had this audience. And people show up, and they wanted to find out, what are you going to get into a poem this time? That's what Patterson's about. What am I going to get into it this time, I think. This is a kind of, well, it's a poem to celebrate the birthday of a very dear friend and another wonderful poet, and also published by North Atlantic. And so if you can find that around here, do find it. It's by Garrett Lansing. It's his collected poems. On his 75th birthday, he lives in Gloucester, which happens to be where Charles Oason centered his later work, but Garrett inhabits, though a friend of Charles's, a very different sense of place than his, as well as sharing it. Some notes on house and woods. Buds like lights draw the hunters in from the woods on their way home, to hear a shelter, to have a shelter under the trees in the living room, as warm as cerise promises, as promises of translucent lights in plastic gallon milk jugs half filled with water, of luminosities aflame encircling the house, but only to stay a little while. Glow warm again, have one hot buttered punch with black tea, whole cinnamon, and cloves and allspice sealed, and be on their way. Not a game shot left, but a story of the woods and the principles in the woods, hunters of their lore, fur of the lore, and their love of the lore to keep warm by, left with us, enough to line a pair of slippers with, or add to the throw for the couch, the coverlet for the bed, hold and keep to the heart the time again in the dark of the year. Or it is we who have come in from the cold and take with us treasures as we depart. So in the house, the mysteries of who comes in, who leaves, who stays, who gives and takes, constantly change, and of the woods. Sometimes calendar princes that every creature listens to, sometimes the music itself, the palace, the wandering, the coming back. By that flame consentaneous, the respiration, the reciprocity of hospitality. Love, to hear a song of that kind. If there is a vertical mystery of shadows become the ground, there is one horizontal of leaving a flung, snapped handkerchief up the air to walk away and jump the walls and hedges and be gone. Come as an iridescent light of flight back and forth, itself invisible within its spectrum blaze, too bright to look at long, unidentifiable except as that to announce the changing of the orders. And the young men in black T-shirts that come and hang around and say so ask, what was that other order you called in? And before that? Which one did you learn and know tell now? And this elaboration to untell. Now to tell? Such obstacles in reciprocity reveal? It's the old house before the house of childhood, owned all along and now come back to as some houses keep their first house within them. And the cedar waxwings from the woods have their wing here too, bring in their gathering, their intense restless congregation and gregariousness, their masks and foraging. For there are houses whose far floors and corridors are streets and groves and open out up hillsides long ago settled and resettled. Not even the occultation and concealment of another geography can keep hidden and not find. The rose panel room, the sea rose tapestry, the secret history of the earth panel, the library whose every avenue opens, books are the city, have their key in music. Made mind, made touch, the conversation of the muses and their love's dream, the secret way through, the thrills. And secretly they also joke, the psychogeography of everyday knife. Keep it so close to your chest, to your life, you can tell it and smell it and muse it and never lose it. And all the epiphanic switches and twitches and folds and holds pockets. In the last hour of the day, the sun comes straight in through the one window of the studio, lighting up jeweled miniature brassicas, the lavenders and St. John's worts, the rose campions, mullein pinks, peonies and lilacs, nightshades covering the back wall, mullion intricate, deep-scrolled and deep-carved hand grasp the blue agate jade against gray forest green pine and spring and citrine, crisp and olive lemon under vein suffused into the polished wood. These are not the gifts we take away, but the gifts take these as bowls made living. And guides, if you pay attention enough to notice and are to be shown, will quietly but insistently indicate which way. The first leader in the pink gum tree at the middle of the cross streets, the nudge and nod to one diner as to a better place to sit in the parlor, and to the parlor, the story. The bass note held, the photo, the candy across the counter. Through, the farewell through, family matters, yours when you hear them, even if not yours before. To the wise cafe lady in her back garden of purple opal trees, who shows first the bow and then the rise, the hands up, in and out fluttering that call down the fluttering, hovering blue jay. In and out, back and forth, in their essential interchange. Not the generation of boys or of girls, not the generation of war, but of delight. And the jay, not tame, not a pet, called down only by her calling when she calls and when she wants to. And the crows and the cats and the possums and the bumps in the night called in the backyard, called to the porch, come to the back door. Or each time they are called and return, in that dimension, her calling is in and renews. old stories. And again, a house by the woods, and the sea is near. And he who comes into the house from the woods, and the woods are the world, and he who brings the house into the woods and knows both, and brings us both, poet-scholar of the Western Avenue, reciprocal poet-scholar of the Eastern Hedge and Fence, master of Lavender House and Lodge, of Mockingbird, Hall of Summer, of Start to Catamount and Return, first met, come up the back stairs and in the back door on the fort to the family of friends, and the family of friends, the family that we have ever made, and the first house known that overlooked the drive-in movie, the sea. Now here, what is the late February doing? Holding brightness up for equinox in the care of old photographs from its album, always some and some of the most cherished lost, or loaned and lost, or unremembered or misremembered in their care, which is the surprise of wonder there. But some are offered now entirely anew and only of this moment. Now, oh, Garrett, holding your birthday up and always surpassing it, and it's held up and you do surpass it, and every other day held up and relished in your sharing with it and us and surpassed, and all enfolded and woven in the silent mystery held up. Companion of companions of every day, of first recognitions of making, of love that makes the household ours, the world, makes first hospitality renewal, polyprognasmy of spirit, beyond far-reaching, dearest brother, nourisher, revealer, magister, makar, delighter, happy birthday at 75. Thank you. Well, these are it's hard moving around in this. It's such a big book, and I'm used to looking at all this stuff in smaller increments, let's say. I do want to read, for Lynn's choosing it a few years back for the Best American Poems or Poetry Annual of 2004, this poem for St. Patrick's Day. If I can find it without messing around too long and looking. Yeah, there it is, I think. It was on St. Patrick's Day that happened to be, as this past spring, it was during our spring break, the middle of March. So it's a kind of meditation on, or musing on, just sitting there at home with the permission of the time and thinking about, we don't know when St. Patrick was born. We don't even know for sure when he died, but the day that traditionally he died is the day that is celebrated as St. Patrick's Day. It's not his birthday, it's his day of demise. And it happened to coincide, in the traditional tabulation of the time with the time of the day it was, too. And, well, as you'll see, others who come into it, at St. Patrick's Day and the saint's death, plus 1,540 years by the tradition, to hear the call of the deer, the thicket call, the creatures, the tide call, the call at a Saturday plus 1,540 hours by the reckoning. Ed Doran came to our motel room talking to my mother and my brother and me, remarking on the rare chance it was to see all of us together at once, and then was gone. And I after him with his keys he'd forgotten, and after my mother on before me, and with hers too. And then everyone gone and not found. Only a boy running down the street ahead of me faster than I could ever manage. The good of aging. And when you die, or when you think you're dead, or when you dream you've died, your feet are turned backwards and your legs and loins, but not your waist, and your arms embrace your head and backwards too, and one of them waves goodbye to the air, in the air, and the dancer on your belly whirls and reaches to regenerate the sun and rides your body like a boat curved on into the sun, holding all you've ever done up like a ticket from amongst the snakes, and blossoms sway to tickle your navel, the entrance and the exit, the swivel and the plug, the cast and the release, and the call. Crows and redbirds, clear cawing and clear calling, and the quiet of Saturday, the quiet of spring break, and the students gone, and the students staying. And the cyclamen fading rosier and rosier from blood crimson to the tide gone into the turning. A small box on Ed's nose, a little book. Nose, tickets, the balancing and the balance and the keys. You will feed others. I am the ghost, and the others are onions, and onions are worlds and worlds within worlds, and water and corn is the hill spirit, and the thicket, and long-leaved and long-eared and long-legged and long gone and come again, and all long a reach. And the cyclamen petals back, blown back by the wind, they nose into, sniff, hound snouts down, ears up, hard on the trace, and long and hard a hold. Hard in the coming through. Hail, who is coming through? There's a much later one, it hasn't been collected. It's such a strange poem that one is happy, I'm happy to share. Three little girls who were trees came across the fields. Beeches or beechen green, their dense and trembling, densely shading leaves. Not from creatures only, and not inimical, but simultaneous and additional. Transubstantial to the room, open at the afternoon. Its bed not slept in or to be, but center and daiast, and to be leaned against and laughed around. Room thrown from long ago for its instant, known from long ago from its instant wainscoting springing to a touch, bringing in the out, letting out the frame. Or some would say the fame itself. Not ours or this, but its, to let them in. And now they send snakes into the ground again and wait for their return. Or for those birds, theirs, from spending half the year in another world, the mind, the workings of. I haven't been keeping track here, Lynn. What's the, I wonder our time?
10:08.
Okay. So how long further, do you think, roughly? You usually figure.
5, 10 minutes. 5, 10 minutes, is that good?
Okay, 5. Let me read two things then. These are both prose pieces, and then I'll finish with a very quick, but I think appropriate part of a long sequence I wrote here. It was the last year and a half, 2 years I lived here. To Max Douglas, a young poet I'd met from St. Joseph, Missouri, who then I didn't see again because he went back where he came from and died of an overdose of heroin. And the poem came to be the conversation we might further have had, but I'll finish with a couple of that. These two brief, pieces, prose pieces, one of them, they're both basically could be call notes. The first is simply call notes. The bearing of tolerance, the knife stab left in the coat, kept and worn till threadbare to know again and again the itinerary of amending the intellect, which is the journey of renouncing the inheritance of all wealth, to become a professor in your own discovery, but of something else. Not the distance covered, but the total lack of anything carried along. A geometric method of politics about as likely to work as of the passions, yet of that yearning, that rectitude, that invention which can be of glory. Why is stupidity and irrationality so deeply sought and felt proud of, and the doctrine of love become the acme of the inquisitor? A science of effects, the sky from them, a religion which is one, as of light and the ground of all design, all desire, a voice whose method of production will be looked for by linking it with the probable sources that most impress the people who don't understand them at all, but like it. Yet as someone who loves to watch spiders fight and making that happen, these eyes of that mind give thread, their mirth, perhaps, the lens for that vision, the life for it and of it and from it, to be men, not destroyers, to leave good soup at the door for a birthday and flowers. For there can never be too much delight or the giving of it, tacit in compassion. There were 3 dogs that became 3 birds and flew away, salt and pepper and mustard, out beyond the shadows of the room where the walls disappear. And a transparent cow, though all of fur and flesh and hide, and a face entirely of darkness, impenetrable as the interior of the open box in the hand that says, "What do you most desire?" And not just the carpet runner that comes into being under your feet out in the street and then into the yard as you approach the front door, nor the figurations in the carpet that are, after all, alive and rustle and run and jump around and bloom and fly, or the weaving itself that is still going on and talks to you as it throws the shuttle back and forth and looks up at you and stops and explains the fabric up out of the ground and the spindles of thread that whirl at the steps set into song by the wool and the sheep that give the wool. And who's that at the door? The lower says, "Let you in." And as they disappeared, they can return. Now salt, now pepper, now mustard, now the milk come for the supper stew, for the hunger and the fear and the desperation to escape, for the barking of birds and the phases of the face, to make sure you never forget in your prosperity the misery and destitution that brought you here, and those who shared it with you, the compassion that created you. And when you've remembered and have restored, disappear again. The moon, too, has its fierce as well as its benevolent aspect beyond its phases and carries a knife either way. And the coat, especially when it's turned inside out, has always known this. Its flickering heard first far away and only much later seen and recognized. Artifice is fully a part of nature. Your dreams are not your own, your love, your life. A phase of eminence has no supplementary dimensions. An impulse, an encounter, a passion, a bright wind of jeweled sustenance, of sun gem, of cloud fire strung, a completely darkened face dressed in a robe of every kind of fur and skin, until the face is in the wind, that things remain enigmatic but not arbitrary. A new logic but not reason, insistent urgency, small racings back and forth between the points of departure to build up another momentum of trajectory. Can you turn and turn sadness about itself and remake its consistency, reshake, reslake what it answers, tenderly as with the gentlest stroking but emphatic? Even though the world of tentativeness is also equally inherent, the more an image is joined to other images, the more it flourishes, until the image itself has no further need for, is no further needed. To seek from enchantment the demands of the actual life, to constantly re-verify the release of invention. And this was in a wonderful magazine that comes out of Seattle called Golden Handcuffs Review. I'm not sure why it's called Golden Handcuffs Review. It's a great name. It invokes, well, lots of things. Lou Rowan edits. It's called Visitations, but then homage to Emerson. And I'm not making any claim for it being in the category of Emerson, except that when I was writing it, I was reading again and getting ready to teach that incredible essay called Experience. And the opening of that. Where do we find ourselves? It begins on this stair that has no beginning and no end, and we're in the middle of it. And I kept passing this man sitting in an alley who appears, so I won't say more of him. And so it's in that spirit. It begins with a quote. I couldn't remember where it came from. It's Stanley Lombardo, like wonderful colleague in classics at KU. He's a translator of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Inferno, and now about to come out, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Reminded me that this quote, "To inform bronze to breathe more gently," is from almost the end of Book 6 of the Aeneid, where Aeneas's father he meets in the underworld, Spirit, is talking about predicting what is to come. And it's a prediction of the age of Augustus. Since we're talking about, that's iron, though, I think, out there, not bronze. So who knows? I don't know. No, because bells are made out of both. Makes you think of Tarkovsky's incredible movie, Andrei Rublev, and the casting of the bell in there by the kid who claims he's a son of a great bell master and who finally acknowledges he doesn't know shit about casting a bell, and he does it nonetheless. To inform bronze to breathe more gently, or marble to smile more quietly, or the erasure or the book self-published with a dedication to whoever will steal it. A work of criticism meant, in fact, for that poetic spirit. A contentiousness, as edgy as the author's drunk, whoever's just come in the room, or he has, between one snort and pulling a knife after another, stabbing the desk to punctuate the periods of the discourse, or an old wooden lectern as long out of fashion as that same tradition of the cocktail party that walks in and finds more places to sit in your apartment than you ever knew you had, sudden, unexpected, the bed not made up, but always the possibility, the tension of the night to have people walking on it, and they do, and the frames they bring along and carve again till those too invite theft and disappear. The sheer crossing of gauze in the air to talk and come back later and reinform invisibility. An instantaneousness of out of nowhere can make a party happen any place just by being there, but always a party with a lot of trouble in it. And being able to see it all at once like a set of simultaneous strobe-like exposures of every movement of the whole night piled on top of one another, and not making a movie out of it, for in the darkness in between each move and flash is the party. The frames that doodle and disappear, the knife edge, the wedge between evangels, the reaching for itself is messenger. The day, night, the day, room, the night. And when the bars close, invite everybody back to the apartment to keep partying on. You come in through the ear of it and set a beat to rotate, 2 longs, 2 shorts, and speed it up with flip-flops and bare feet on out the window, onto the roof, on into the unfinished next door through the walls. One way of bringing an old lover back and through again. You heard once long ago and followed on out into that country. Out there, that way. The day-night, the night room, the day. Else now, how could you ever at all? What about the man just yearned after? The jumping koala pot, the corn husk cigarettes that burn as fast as a match or faster, the silence in all the valleys, and at the western gates, the autobiography of still so much to decide on, the history that's there before any history. In us, not as a depth in memory, but as an immediate disorder in the mind, and grown darker. The man sitting 2 rows ahead on the bus earlier reading Borges retrieved the copy just bought of after Borges when it slid off the seat and under his, but he didn't know labyrinths. He was the labyrinth, or unerringly encountered among cherry trees in bloom, very old, very sinuously trunked, or the flowering paths that do not yield or satisfy, as though you think you're there with people you know and love and are, or how do you know they're there, and how do you know they aren't? Never easily amazed and by yourself, who is in there with you? Who do you keep true company with inside? Not images, but known, or who is known except outside and those you do not know? And picked up and handed back the pencil and pens that had dropped out of the inside jacket pocket when the book fell, as quiet and completely compactly elegant as the fancy man outside the Music Menu Club in Greektown, Detroit, silk enclosed as with the fur of every kind of moth. He was a mathematician of shrink-wrapped packaging, he said, or at least a tactician of soft-type polygonies, and was there with his girlfriend, a former bar waitress who said they used to make their Negronis with rum and all the rest. The surround of a life, the rocky barrennesses to run off into and hide in when they come after you. A friendly, edgy guy who offered to make me a copy of it all, but then said, no, better burn a CD right and be there in the car, then thunder, and neither of us and the both of us and the power in the car to listen. And a month later, the Sunday Styles in the Times reported a Cuba Libre made with gin. Gin and. In the alley at the side door behind the bakery, he sits, a white sheet wrapped around him up to the bald of the head, looking off into the Presto and the gas pumps, circumfused in air into the dark time to come. And if you crossed Alec Guinness and Claude Rains were Daddy Warbucks, who just died, but with no blunked out eyes and not all bald, yet still daddy him, come up to you on the street downtown and started crying. He just couldn't say it anymore, the blocking off of every kind of emotion, till he could no more speak out against, and had to speak out against, on into the dark autumn, cold autumn, sitting in the alley, veering in the mind, while motionless, hopeless to survive, but walking in the woods under the gas pumps, ricocheting, trunk to trunk, leaf left to leaf to let go. You go find. You go find. You go find. And I'll finish with this. This long poem to Max Douglas was like getting off out of an accumulation of years of living out here, and the link back to where I'd grown up. Kansas mostly, but not just that, everything. And I'll just read the ending of it and end with this. For in it, Lowell is certainly very central. goodness, where is it? At this edge of the continent, yesterday it was the blinding Pentecostal light down over Alcatraz, over the passage between Alcatraz and Treasure Island, taking the ochred waters westward as the Reyes to have moved 300 million years to put Bolinas abreast of Tamalpais this afternoon as to see it all. Reyes, one of the king's crowns of the earth, out of sight behind Marin, vital, necessary, incessant as sight, as old as sight. Did trilobites see mud? Certainly. The Jurassic longing saurians crossed Salenia with their tiny, nearsighted, foliage-ridden eyes, straining to catch their tails across Laurasia, coming back to bite Ouroboros across the most ancient ocean. We are the inheritors of that gaze. So from a rock in the Berkeley hills, Lowell and I watched the door of light fold under the mantle of earth across the evening bed as the low rain laced in below us, advanced to the battle of the land against the sky, not to be won. These distances of paradise as the step of airy nothingness from Remillard to Cragmont Parks across the instant vault of happiness to vault the jointure of the continents to come. Thanks very much. I don't know what the procedure is, but I'd be happy to, as they used to say, entertain questions. I don't know if that's the verb that would be used, but I would certainly, if that's okay? Yeah. Speak. I mean, respond if you speak or ask. Anything. Yes, at all. If you're looking at each other, you know, that means you're thinking about asking something. And if you don't ask, there other people are not going to ask either. So, you know. So I tell my students, or as one old professor used to say, I'm very patient. You know? But not to press about that at all. But how kind of you.
I'll just help you host.
And to for all of you to have come. Occasion to read here, it's been a long time, is very welcome.
Anybody? One question?
Yeah, please.
Well, you're certainly
Jeffrey.
capable of the brief and the extended, and you've braided them together to make this massive volume. And I just want to know, looking back on it, what you think the difference is between working on an incredibly short scale and working in massive architectures.
Oh, I don't know. You know, it's in the impetus, that thing for Max. It's just that suddenly, here was somebody I'd spoken with one evening and gone on, and I'd liked his work, and he was gone. There wasn't any further communication possible, and short of having a smart medium and something like that wasn't going to work. So I didn't know where I was going to go, but I felt like I had something in it that needed to be said. And then there's another one I didn't read from about the mountain man Jedediah Smith, because a friend of mine, I'd known him as an undergraduate who also, he did his doctorate here in Chinese economic history. And we drove up to Oregon to see friends. Great time. Started up the valley, came back down the coast route, and we stopped to pee in the middle of the night. And there was a big historical sign there that Jedediah Smith and his mountain men and fur traders and whatnot had been virtually wiped out by an Indian attack. Smith and others escaped, but they lost everything. And when I got back, I wanted to find out more about that, and as I dug around in it, and I found out he'd been killed in Kansas by the Comanches, and one of the people in the wagon train he was leading went on to become one of the first Anglos to settle Humboldt County here in California. And I thought, I don't know what this is, but there's something going on here. And it took me months and months to get those two things together, the trip we made and what had happened with that man and his work and so forth. And that's, you can't make that happen. It comes, I think. It's wonderful when it does, that you've got work to do, you know you got the work to do, you got the push, the impetus in yourself to do it, and you don't know what you're going to do. You're just going to follow it and find out. And then other things come, there they are. But some of these little ones took a long time, too. They weren't necessarily real quick.
Any other, like, one last? Mr.
Yes,
Bernier?
certainly. Bob?
Remind me, is that airy nothingness possible?
Well, airy nothingness, yeah, it's in the Tempest, certainly. I probably wasn't even remembering that at the time. There are other things there that are quoted or are put in italics. That, for example, the business that starts with the coat being knifed and so forth, that's Spinoza, who was attacked on the street with intent to be killed, and he wore that coat always to remember. Things like that that come in and out. But yeah, airy nothingness, certainly. But it was lovely this evening, and to hear, as I say, a poem about Oakland, the beginning of the ongoing poem of Oakland, of oneself in Oakland, most important. But not just your limited self, one's limited self. The feeling of a place that matters. Can be a place you hate, too, of course, if you want to transcribe. Well, thank you, all of you, very much.
Thanks, all of you, for coming. As you have probably figured out, the Cal Bookstore is here with copies of various of Kenneth Irby's books, including the new massive doorstopper one from which he read. And also there's copies of Withstand, Dan Glass's magazine, which, if I heard correctly, he's offering as a freebie. So first come, first served, don't run. Thanks all of you for coming, and we'll see you at the next event.